Welcome to chapter 2. We are focusing on this chapter on something very basic of the R programming language. And I think if you understand it better, that will help you a lot to write better R code in the future and makes you faster. However, before we start with R, I want to do an exercise with you. The idea of the exercise is that you start to construct your own programming language. And surprisingly, I think that will help you to understand the R programming language. So I have concretely 2 tasks. I want that you imagine you could talk to your computer and you want to tell your computer you want to compute a mean score and also regression analysis. So for the mean score, you have a variable which is called x, which is part of a data frame called df. And for the regression model, you imagine to have a predictor x and an outcome variable y, which both can be found in a data frame df. So now my question is, after you pause the video, how would you phrase that to tell your computer these 2 tasks? Second, if you have done it, can you understand the structure of how did you say it? And can you then also make it shorter? So you have 3 tasks. First, verbalize it. Second, try to understand the underlying structure of your commands and try to make it as short as possible. Okay, now it's time to pause the video and try this out with the 2 examples. I'm sure this will help you. Yes, pause the video and do it. Okay, I hope you tried it and now we can discuss the solution. So maybe your first solution was something like the following. Please computer, can you compute the mean score of the variable x using the data frame df? And for the regression model, you might have something very similar. Compute the regression with the predictor x, the outcome variable y, using the data frame df. So of course this is more human-based, but first now we want to understand the underlying structure of this command. Overall in R we have only 2 components. So I would say the first command is that you have an action. You want to do something. So here in our example, we either want to compute the mean score or you want to compute a regression model. That's your task. In order to do that in R, you have to call a function. However, of course, just telling the computer compute the mean score is not enough. The computer needs more details. And the details are normally in brackets and are called arguments. So let's have a look at both the functions and the arguments in R. Okay, let's have a look what functions are. So if you want to compute something like a mean score, you have to call a function. And a function is normally just a word or sometimes 2 words which are connected with the dot. So now let's have a look what the function is called to compute a mean score. And surprisingly it's very simple because the function we have to call for the mean is called mean. So that's not too difficult. Now let's see what it is for regression. That's maybe a little bit more surprising. It's just LM. But you can see it makes sense if you know that a linear regression model is just a linear model and LM is the shortcut for linear model. And these functions are very powerful. Just imagine again that you want to compute a mean score. Now, in general, it is not so easy to compute the mean score because you would have to add up all the numbers of a variable and then divide it by how many numbers they are. Instead of going through all the source code of all the steps, we can just call a function which the source code is already included. So somebody else has programmed the source code and the only thing we have to do is to call this code, so call the function. So if you have understood what a function is, then the next step is just to learn several useful functions. So let's have a look at some more examples. So if you want to compute the standard deviation, then we use the function SD. If you want to know what the names are of all the columns, we call names. If you want to read in a data set, we have now a function based on two words. So read dot and then the ending of the data set. So here we have a CSV file, so we call it read.csv. Now the head is very useful because it allows us to see the first 6 rows of a data set. And this is super useful if you have a new data set and we want to check if we read it in properly. Dim is something very useful because dim means the dimension of a data set, which means we can see how many rows and columns we have. str is a shortcut for structure, and that gives us an insight of the structure of the data object, including, for example, variable types, which become very useful then in the near future. So maybe you also want to do some analysis like an ANOVA, then the function is AOV, or you want to combine variables into a vector. That's, you will see in the future, very useful. Then there is a function, the C function, which either means combined or Connecticut values. And of course there are many more functions, and over the course of all the chapters we learn the most important one. Remember, at our exercise, just telling the computer to compute a mean score is not enough, because the computer needs more details. So the next step is to discuss the arguments. You remember the exercise at the beginning? We cannot just tell the computer to compute a mean score, because the computer doesn't know which variable to use. So we have to give some details. And the details are given as argument into the brackets. So after the function we have an opening and a closing bracket, and there we put in our arguments. So let's look at our first example of computing a mean score of the variable x of the data set df. Remember, one of the goals in the exercise was to make it as short as possible, and let's compare if your solution was similar short. So remember, we just call the function mean, and in the brackets we have now the data frame df, then something new, the $sign, and then the variable x. So the $sign is part of the base R commands, which is super useful here, but generally we try to avoid this kind of base R terminology. But here it's useful. So the $sign simply means that we tell R in which data set R can find our variable x. Now, the arguments can be from very simple, like some default situation, sometimes even empty, to include one argument or multiple arguments. And then they are passed on to the functions so that the function can care about all the details. Now let's have a look at some more examples. So when we want to read in a dataset, of course we have to tell R what the name of the dataset is, and because it is a name, it is in quotation marks. But of course you can see we also maybe want to tell R more specifics. For example, here we define that some of the values are missing values, and then you can see we have more than one argument. Or here is a solution for an ANOVA. So after the function we start with the dependent variable, which is here called y. Then comes the tilde or the wiggly line, which means, okay, y is predicted by something, and here it's predicted by a group variable called group. Then for a regression model we have it very similar. We have either the dependent variable on the left side, then the tilde, and then the predictor, which is here x. And here is some example. If you have 4 values which we want to combine into a new column, then we can use the C function. Now at the end, sometimes it's difficult to remember which kind of arguments we are using for a function, or it should be used. And so we can use always the help function. So we just use help, and then in the brackets we include the name of the function. And then in our studio pops up a new window and where we can find additional information. This was a short video about function and arguments. Now the next one is about doing an exercise, and then at the end we discuss something more about objects.